Okay. So I'm going to take this from a slightly different area because I wanted to first, I wasn't quite satisfied with last meetings in terms of the transition from 5 into 6, because we were talking about the issue of generalizability of the concept and how, and I think the second point was how it's useful. And what I wanted to do was, I didn't feel satisfied about how we addressed the issue of generalizability, which is why I offered to come in there and form more of a bridge between it. I want to put aside the question of usefulness, and I want to talk about the claim of generalizability, but from a Kuhnian perspective. And what I mean by that was Kuhn's fundamental assumption that researchers tend to form very, very small communities, only about 100 people. One of the nice things about that is when you have a community of just 100 people, trust starts to be part of that. So cooperative behavior tends to rely on small community behavior, small communities forming. And if there's about 100 people in a community, and if there's about 10 million researchers around the world, which is a reasonable estimate, you should have about 100,000 communities. So the question then isn't whether the triple helix is generalizable. The question is, what research community does this triple helix come from? And what research community has adopted it? And which research communities looked at it and say, I don't want any part of it? Because generalizability is a matter of whether it's accepted or rejected by a particular community. And to do that, I'm going to take all of the documents in the Scopus database, it's about 50 million, that includes cited books, and do very sophisticated community detection algorithms that look at who cites whom, to come up with 100,000 document clusters. That's each 100,000 dots there. Then you use some very computational linguistic techniques to get an idea of what's the words that are used to characterize each community. And you link communities that are similar, that are next to each other because they have a shared common language. You put it on a visualization, and this is essentially all science. Physics is dark purple, computer science is light purple. Some people can jokingly call it physics light. This is engineering, this is blue is chemistry, green of course is environment, earth sciences are brown, your medical areas are red, brain research comes up here in yellow. Your humanities is in the center area, I'm sorry, the social sciences are in the center area and the humanities are over in here. So the first question is, let's look at the triple helix and ask ourselves, where was it cited? Which communities rely on this, that cite this particular area? And it's in the social sciences. This shouldn't surprise anybody. And the largest community, which I'm going to have just number for now, we'll understand their identities later on. That's 1,000 sites were by people in this community, publishing articles in this community that cite the original 2000 article. The next one you got here is community 172. It goes down to 280, and then it drops down really small. So we're only going to look at the first two because these are the communities that most likely are the sources of the article. And the first one there, 639, is on academic entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial universities, technology transfers. In just 1 year, this community is producing 470 papers, 469 papers. Now, we also look at import and export activity. So an import is, let's say you write an article, that's one of the 669 papers. Most of your references belong to the papers that were previously assigned to the community, so you're assigned to that community. But you had 4 references that belong to another community. That means you, at least 4 or more. That means you're building on that community. You're importing an idea from that other community. And that other community is exporting it. Now, their number of exports and imports are exactly the same because everyone's a link. If you look at the share of activity over all of science, imports and exports and production should be exactly the same because it's just a share number. And that should be flat over time. When you see them depart from flatness and on top of each other, it tells you something qualitatively about the community. You can see the production is in black. You can see the input, the importing of ideas is higher than production, which means it's an open community. It's looking for ideas all the time. And since the community has been around for a while, a lot of people listen to it. Okay, that's one of the communities, and I understand this is where Etzkowitz has done a lot of his publications in this area. The other one is in regional innovation system, and we just heard from our first speaker about the regional innovation systems and industrial districts and industrial clusters. And again, 400 papers, very, very healthy. In general, production has been going down lately. It used to import a lot, but that's dropping, but it's been very influential. Well, these are communities that one could say are aligned with the original concept. Okay. Now let's look at the question of what communities will adopt or not adopt that. And to do that, we're going to start with a review of science and technology studies by Ben Martin about 10 years ago. He identified 155 documents that represented the knowledge base of studies in science and technology. This is a very influential article. He's an influential author, and it was a very rigorous, intelligent way of doing it. And the question is, where were these 155 documents? Well, sure, 639 is there. That makes sense. But you have a huge number down here that's closer to humanities. You've got two of them on this purplish island over here. You've got one up in here. And the question is, they're distant from each other. There are distances, and that distances may mean that the very nature that they speak a different language in terms of using different words, different concepts, different disciplinary perspectives, they may not be as accepted. So let's look at the purple island. That's the island I live on. It was using a triple helix. I love the idea because it had an innovative academic, Derek DeSolo Price, who kind of, when it was formed in the 1980s, who came up with a lot of important ideas looking at, in this case, the ISI databases. Eugene Garfield is the one who started ISI. He was the commercial actor who had to figure out how to keep this company alive. And they got public funding at NSF. And that synergy between those three actors working well actually was critical to the formation of this community back in the 1980s. What's it talk about? Well, these are the impact factors, citation counts, eigenfactors. Basically, it uses Web of Science, Scopus, now Dimensions, PubMed, anything, and tells you, it kind of evaluates individuals and researchers and labs and nations and all that kind of stuff. It's interesting to look at its area because notice how little import of ideas this community has. That means it doesn't tend to listen to others. That's just, I would say, one interpretation of that data. It's having more influence afterwards. So that's an interesting community. And the answer of whether it's accepted by, Loet's ideas will be obvious after the next one. The second one is also Derek DeSolo Price. And here he was looking at how research evolves. And he was looking at what's called the research front, which is the most recent publications and their most recent links to one another. The commercial actor, one of the major ones, is the commercial side of a group at the University of Leiden called CWTS. The funders are almost always hidden, and you rarely see any articles. This is the area that I publish, except for instead of Price, we rely on Kuhn. We take the same data. Instead of a research front, we talk about research communities. And I have not been allowed to talk about who funds my research until about 3 years ago. It was the first time a funder said, yes, you can actually talk about that. What do we talk about? The intellectual structure of field using words and citations. Been growing, relatively expected relationship between imports and production. And there's been a significant export of ideas in the last 5 years, mostly based on visualization techniques that anybody can use to do a better job of understanding the history of their particular field of research. Now, would these two communities adopt Loet? Well, I'd have to kind of point, it would be kind of obvious because Loet publishes a tremendous amount on this particular island. And I think it was 9 years ago, he got the Derek DeSolo Price Award for his contributions to the community's that are on this purple island that tends to look at how to utilize bibliometric data. Now let's look at some of the other ones where I don't think he's going to be necessarily ideas generalizable because of the nature of the community. The first is the largest one, which is Latour. I don't know too much about who is any commercial actor there, and I don't know who funds it. It'd be interesting if you all know to share that with me. But 300 papers, look how little imports have been going on, highly influential. Is it likely that they would import an idea that's distant from them? Probably not, especially when their format is more about there are many, many actors, and it tends to look at each actor has its own rights, including the machinery in the lab has the rights, and the mussels that you collect when you're doing mussel farming have rights, and they all should be at the table in negotiating the rights of what should be done. Not criticizing that, it is actually a very intriguing conceptual way of thinking about things, but it does not have to do with communication and collaboration. The other one is up there in where it's looking at a different issue, and this is science policy interfaces, much more from a political science perspective. Here you get this is a more open area. Notice it does import a lot. It does have good influence in there. Here you'll see the kind of article that says, look, if you try and do an analysis, a bibliometric analysis to try and get an answer to climate change, you will actually create more gridlock in the system, because once it's polarized politically, both sides will just take the same thing and either say it proves their point or it's false data. So it doesn't help, it doesn't come up with answers. This idea of a rational solution says, no, that's not what happens. When you have a polarized system, people are no longer looking for a collaborative, a cooperative solution. And again, this perspective has a very valid perspective, especially when we look at a lot of these issues. So in summary, and I wanted to do this quickly, because chapter 5 to me had more to do with looking at the triple helix from the point of view of this island over here that deals with scientometrics. When you get to chapter 6 and you look at the measurements, it's all around just the academic entrepreneurship over here, but the regional innovation that is over in this area. This general area deals with innovation, and then you get more into the economic areas over in here. But this is an area that very much relies on a more evolutionary Schumpeterian view that is just a common language and a common framework that takes history and account. If this overall circle represents the kind of what could be pulled on for science and technology studies, there is the political science point of view and the gridlock and the polarization that's pointed out in here. There's a representation from the humanities that says, what is community life really like? Not just in the lab, which is a very small unit of analysis, not just in a profession like engineers, but what you and I do as researchers in terms of the small groups of people we tend to talk to. Some of those communities I would suggest are actually quite abusive. And some of those are very collaborative, and you can actually see them sometimes in the reviews of journal papers. There are certain journals I don't like to submit to because the reviews are unbelievably caustic. And the other ones, the reviews are helpful, which is very interesting in terms of what that means in terms of the actual nature, the humanity of community life, which is more I'd likely to be oppressed by here. And then Jerome pointed out the one that was missed, I think, over here, which is education. One of the major issues is in science education and how we do that. It was missed in the initial quantitative studies of science and technology. There isn't an emphasis on science education, being in the United States where I think we suffer from not emphasizing science education. It is an important issue in terms of the overall issue. So Loet has a home here. He has another home over here in these communities. There's a nice little study about experts. distinguishing between hedgehogs and foxes. And a hedgehog is defined as someone who is an expert in one area. To me, they have a home in one community. A fox is the one who likes to travel. Loet likes to travel. And that I really commend him for, because being able to go from here and go from there and then use the language in here to contribute to the communities in that area is quite laudable. And I think I'll stop there for questions. Any questions?